The first crack didn't make a sound loud enough for anyone to panic, but I heard it like a gunshot. The ceramic coffee mug in my hand rattled against the granite countertop as a faint, almost polite tremor rolled beneath my boots, subtle enough that most people would have blamed it on a passing truck or maybe just their imagination. But I knew better, because I'd been waiting for that exact moment ever since the day they buried the creek under 6 inches of concrete and called it progress. I stepped out onto my back porch, the early morning air still carrying that faint chalky scent of cured cement mixed with damp soil. And across the cul-de-sac I saw it, a hairline fracture running along the edge of Linda Harper's brand new driveway, thin as a pencil line, but stretching farther than it had any right to. Like something underneath was slowly pushing back after months of being held down. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've spent 15 years studying how land moves, how water behaves when you try to control it, how pressure builds in places people don't think to look. In 3 months ago, I stood right where I am now, watching a crew of contractors pour truckload after truckload of concrete over a natural runoff channel that had been there longer than any of us, longer than the subdivision, longer than the county records even bothered to mention. And I remember the heat of that day, the thick chemical smell of wet mix burning the back of my throat, the steady hiss of it spreading out like a gray tide while Linda stood there in her pressed white blouse, smiling like she was unveiling a monument instead of sealing off a living system. She called it a drainage upgrade, said it would increase property values and modernize the neighborhood. And when I tried to explain what that creek actually did, that it wasn't just water, it was pressure relief, it was movement, it was balance, she gave me that tight smile of hers and said, "We build stability here, Mr. Cole, not mud." Like she could rewrite physics with a board vote and a contractor's invoice. I went home that night and pulled the original survey maps, the ones most people never bother to read, tracing the faint blue lines that showed exactly where that water used to go, exactly how it fed into the surrounding soil, exactly why nothing had ever sunk there before. And I sent her everything, emails, diagrams, even a simplified report spelling it out in plain English. If you trap water underground, it doesn't disappear, it waits, it builds, it looks for a way out. Her reply came back 12 minutes later, short and sharp. "We've got permits. We'll be fine." And that was the moment I stopped arguing, because you can't convince someone who thinks paperwork outweighs reality. So I started measuring instead, quiet and methodical, logging groundwater levels after every rain, noting how the soil held moisture longer than it used to, how the ground felt just a little softer underfoot each week, how the air itself seemed heavier before storms, like it was holding its breath. And now, standing here watching that crack stretch another inch across her driveway as the sun climbs higher, I can feel it all coming back at once. The warning signs, the ignored data, the slow, patient buildup. And the thing about pressure is, it doesn't need permission. It doesn't care about permits or property lines or how much someone paid for their foundation. It just waits until the structure above it forgets what's holding it up, and then, without raising its voice, it reminds everyone exactly how the ground works. I still remember the exact sound of the water under that land before they covered it, a low, steady trickle that you could only hear if you stood still long enough, like the ground itself was breathing. And growing up here, my father used to bring me down to that narrow strip of rock where the creek curved through the back of our property, and he would tap his boot against the soil and say, "Listen close, Ethan, this is what keeps everything standing." And back then I did not fully understand what he meant, but I never forgot the feeling of that place. The way the air stayed cooler even in August, the way the grass was always a deeper green along that path, the way the ground felt firm but alive under your feet. And years later, when I studied civil engineering and specialized in soil behavior and water systems, those memories started to line up with the data in a way that made everything make sense. Because what most people call empty land is not empty at all. It is a system, a balance of pressure, moisture, and movement that works quietly until someone interrupts it. And that is exactly what Linda Harper and her HOA board did the moment they approved that construction plan, without understanding what they were building on top of. The day the trucks rolled in, I stood at the edge of my fence line watching them unload, the deep rumble of diesel engines vibrating through the ground, the sharp metallic clank of chutes swinging into place, and then the first wave of wet concrete sliding out, thick and gray and final, spreading over the creek bed like it had somewhere important to be. And I remember walking over to the site supervisor, boots crunching on loose gravel, asking him if he had seen the subsurface drainage report, if he knew there was a natural runoff channel directly beneath that section, and he just shrugged, wiped his hands on his vest, and told me he was following approved plans, that everything had been signed off by the HOA and the county. And that was the problem right there, because paper does not change the behavior of water, and signatures do not redirect pressure. Over the next few weeks, I watched them build fast, faster than I expected, framing houses, pouring foundations, laying down driveways that gleamed smooth and perfect under the sun, and every time it rained, even just a light shower, I would walk the perimeter and check the low points, and I started to notice small things that nobody else seemed to see. Puddles forming where they never used to, soil staying damp long after the rest of the ground had dried, a faint softness underfoot near the edges of the new concrete slabs. And I wrote everything down: dates, rainfall amounts, estimated saturation levels. Because that is what you do when you know something is coming, but you cannot stop it directly. You document it. You let the evidence build the story for you. The HOA meetings became almost routine after that. Linda standing at the front of the room with her printed agendas and confident tone, talking about neighborhood growth and long-term value, while I sat in the back with my notes and maps, occasionally raising my hand to point out what was happening beneath their feet. And every time I did, I could feel the room shift, not because they believed me, but because they did not want to, because acknowledging a problem like that means accepting responsibility for it. And Linda was not the kind of person who accepted responsibility for anything that threatened her plans. She would nod politely, thank me for my input, and then move right along like I had commented on the color of the mailboxes instead of the stability of the ground itself. And so I stopped trying to convince them with words and focused on something else entirely, something quieter and far more patient, because land does not argue, it does not negotiate, it simply responds. And every measurement I took, every log entry I recorded, every subtle shift I felt under my boots told me the same thing. The system they buried was not gone. It was building pressure, and sooner or later, that pressure was going to introduce itself in a way nobody in that room could ignore. The rain that finally set everything in motion was not dramatic, not the kind that floods streets or makes headlines, just a steady 12-hour system that rolled in from the west and settled over the neighborhood like a damp blanket. The kind of rain most people sleep through without a second thought. But I stayed awake listening to it, counting the rhythm against the roof, because I knew exactly what that amount of water meant for soil that no longer had a way to breathe. By morning, the air felt heavy, thick with that earthy scent that rises when the ground is holding more than it should. And as I stepped outside, my boots sank just a fraction deeper into the grass than they had the day before, subtle but unmistakable, like the land was starting to soften from underneath. I walked the perimeter again, clipboard in hand, checking the same markers I had been tracking for weeks, and every reading told the same story. Moisture levels elevated beyond normal retention, drainage non-existent, pressure building below the surface where nobody could see it. And when I reached the edge of the newly poured section near Linda's property, I noticed something else, the faint outline of water staining along the seam where concrete met soil, a darkened edge that had not been there before, creeping outward in thin, irregular lines like veins spreading under skin. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood started to notice smaller things. A front door that no longer closed as smoothly, a window frame that needed an extra push, a driveway that seemed to dip just slightly toward one side. And I watched it all unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet certainty, because these were not random issues, they were early signals, the kind engineers learn to respect long before anything actually fails. Linda, of course, dismissed it immediately. I heard her outside talking to one of the homeowners, her voice carrying that same confident edge, blaming minor settling and normal post-construction adjustments, phrases that sound reassuring if you do not understand what they actually mean. And I could see the relief on their faces as they accepted her explanation, because people want simple answers. They want to believe their investment is secure, that everything beneath them is as solid as it looks. That evening I reviewed my data again. Rainfall totals, saturation curves, soil composition estimates. And I ran the numbers one more time, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain of what was coming next, and every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. The water had nowhere left to go. It was trapped beneath a layer that was never designed to hold it, building hydrostatic pressure slowly and evenly across the entire section of land. And the thing about that kind of pressure is that it does not release all at once. It shifts, it redistributes. It looks for the weakest point and starts there, quietly at first, almost politely, by the next morning. The crack I had seen in Linda's driveway had widened just enough to catch the toe of my boot when I stepped over it. And as I looked down at that thin line stretching farther across the surface, I could feel the deeper movement beneath it. Not something you hear, not something you see directly, but something you understand if you have spent enough time studying how ground behaves under stress. And I realized in that moment that this was no longer a possibility or a projection. It had already begun. The system they buried was pushing back, and the neighborhood was about to learn that stability is not something you can pour out of a truck and expect to hold forever. By the end of that week, the neighborhood had stopped calling it minor settling and started using quieter words, the kind people say when they are not ready to admit something is wrong. Phrases like slight shifting or just the house adjusting. But I could see it in the way they walked their driveways, slower now, eyes scanning the ground instead of their phones, noticing the uneven lines that had not been there before, the subtle tilt in surfaces that used to feel perfectly level. I was out early that morning, the sun barely over the rooftops, when I saw Linda standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed, staring down at the crack that had widened into something you could no longer ignore, nearly a quarter inch at its widest point and stretching across the entire slab like a fault line drawn with a ruler. And for the first time since this all began, her expression was not confident. It was tight, controlled, like she was trying to contain a thought she did not want to fully form. I walked past without saying anything at first, listening instead to the small details most people miss. The faint creak of stressed material as the slab adjusted under shifting pressure, the soft squelch of saturated soil just beyond the concrete edge, and even the air felt different, heavier, as if the ground was holding more weight than it was designed for. Later that day, a contractor truck pulled up, the kind with toolboxes lining the bed and a magnetic company logo on the door, and two men stepped out with measuring tapes and levels, moving slowly across the driveway, crouching, checking, exchanging looks that did not match the casual reassurances they gave Linda when she asked what was going on. Because I recognized that look, it is the one you give when the numbers do not add up, but you are not ready to say it out loud. I stayed on my side of the property line, leaning against the fence, watching as they placed a level across the surface and adjusted it twice, then a third time, as if repeating the measurement might change the result, but it did not, and one of them finally straightened up and said something too low for me to hear. But I saw Linda's shoulders stiffen just slightly in response. That evening, the homeowners group chat lit up with messages, photos of small cracks appearing in different driveways, doors sticking, baseboards separating just enough to catch the eye. And the tone had shifted from casual to concerned, questions replacing assumptions, and I could almost map the progression in real time. Each message another data point confirming what I already knew. The pressure beneath that concrete was no longer contained evenly. It was redistributing, finding weak spots, testing the limits of every foundation built on top of it. I went back inside and opened my laptop, pulling up the logs I had been keeping since the first day of construction, rainfall totals, soil moisture readings, notes on surface changes, and I overlaid them with the layout of the development, tracing the path of the original creek beneath the houses, visualizing how the water was moving now that its natural route had been sealed, and the pattern was clear. It was following the same path it always had, just slower, building force as it went, pressing upward and outward against everything in its way. The next morning, as I stepped outside with my coffee, I noticed a new sound, faint but distinct, a soft ticking noise coming from the concrete across the street, like something adjusting under tension, and as I stood there listening, I realized it was not a single point. It was happening in multiple places at once, a quiet chorus of stress working its way through the structure. And that was the moment it became undeniable, not just to me, but to anyone willing to look closely. This was no longer about a single crack or a single driveway. The entire section of land was responding to what had been done to it. and the system they thought they had erased was now rewriting the rules beneath their feet. The HOA meeting that Friday night was the first time I saw real uncertainty ripple through that room. Not loud, not chaotic, but present in the way people avoided eye contact and clutched printed photos like they were holding proof of something they still did not fully understand. And I could smell the faint mix of coffee and nervous tension as I stepped inside, taking a seat along the back wall like I always did, my notebook resting quietly in my lap while Linda stood at the front with her usual posture, shoulders straight, voice measured, trying to project control even as the situation beneath her feet was slipping beyond it. She started with the same tone she always used, calling the issues cosmetic adjustments and normal structural settling. But this time the words did not land the same, because now there were too many examples. Too many small failures stacking together into something that felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern. And one homeowner stood up, holding his phone out with a photo of a gap forming between his garage floor and the wall, just under half an inch, but clean and straight like it had been measured with intent. And another spoke up about a kitchen tile line that had shifted overnight, and then another about a door that would not latch anymore no matter how hard they tried. And as each voice added to the room, I could see Linda's composure tightening, her responses becoming shorter, more controlled, like she was trying to keep the conversation contained before it reached a point she could not manage. When it was my turn, I did not stand right away. I let the room settle, listening to the low hum of concern, the quiet shifting of chairs, the air thick with that unspoken question everyone was starting to ask. And then I stepped forward, placing a single printed sheet on the table in front of her, the same diagram I had sent weeks earlier, showing the original path of the creek, the soil composition beneath the development, and the expected pressure zones if that flow was interrupted. And I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply said, the ground is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that feels heavier than any argument, because it carries the weight of recognition. Linda glanced down at the paper, then back at me, and I could see the shift in her eyes, not understanding, but awareness that something was no longer under her control. And she responded the only way she knew how, by deflecting, by mentioning permits, inspections, approvals, all the layers of authority that made the project look legitimate on paper. But none of that addressed what was actually happening below the surface, and the room felt that disconnect. You could hear it in the way people stopped nodding and started listening more carefully, weighing her words against what they were seeing in their own homes. After the meeting, small groups formed in the parking lot. Quiet conversations under the glow of overhead lights, people comparing notes, measuring experiences against each other, and I stayed off to the side, watching it unfold, because this was the moment where perception changes, where doubt replaces certainty, and once that shift happens, it does not go back. And as I walked home, the night air cool against my skin, I could still hear that faint ticking sound from the concrete in the distance, subtle but steady, like a clock that had already been set in motion long before anyone realized it was counting down. The next rain came faster than I expected. Not a storm, just a steady gray sky that hung low over the neighborhood all day, dripping a quiet, persistent kind of water that does not rush but seeps. And that is the kind that matters most when the ground has nowhere left to send it. And by mid-afternoon, I could already feel the change under my boots, that slight give returning in places that had been firm just days before. And when I stepped onto the sidewalk across from Linda's property, I noticed the crack had not only widened but deepened, the edges no longer clean but starting to crumble slightly, as if the surface was losing its grip on what lay beneath it. The smell of damp soil mixed with that faint mineral scent of stressed concrete filled the air, and I crouched down for a closer look, running my fingers lightly along the edge, feeling the subtle vibration that most people would never notice, a low, almost imperceptible movement that told me the pressure was no longer static. It was shifting, redistributing in real time. By evening, the neighborhood had changed its tone completely. No more casual explanations. No more talk of cosmetic issues. Now it was phone calls, contractors coming back for second inspections, voices carrying sharper edges across driveways as people compared what they were seeing inside their homes. And I caught fragments of conversations drifting through the air, words like uneven, sinking, foundation, spoken with a kind of disbelief that comes when something solid starts behaving like it is not. Linda's house became the center of attention without her ever asking for it, because the signs there were impossible to ignore now. Her front walkway had developed a noticeable dip, just under an inch at its lowest point, enough that rainwater pooled instead of running off, and her garage door, which used to glide open smoothly, now hesitated halfway before completing its track, the motor straining slightly, as if it was compensating for something out of alignment. I watched from my porch as another contractor arrived, this one carrying more precise equipment, a laser level that cast a thin red line across the surface, and I saw the moment he realized what he was looking at, the way he paused, adjusted the device, then checked it again from a different angle, confirming the same result, a gradual but measurable slope where there should have been none. Linda stood beside him, arms folded tight, asking questions in that controlled voice she used when she was trying to stay ahead of a situation. But the answers she was getting were not the kind you can smooth over with confidence. They were cautious, technical, filled with phrases like soil movement and subsurface pressure. And for the first time, I saw her glance toward the line of houses behind her, following the same invisible path I had traced weeks ago on paper, the path of the buried creek now, pushing upward through everything built on top of it. That night, I updated my logs again, rainfall totals, ground response, structural changes observed across multiple properties, and when I plotted it all together, the pattern was no longer just clear, it was accelerating. The intervals between changes were shrinking, the effects becoming more pronounced with each cycle, and I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint ticking sound outside growing just a little more frequent, like a system moving closer to a threshold it could not hold indefinitely. And I knew then that what was coming next would not be gradual enough for anyone to ignore, because once the pressure reached a certain point, the ground would not adjust quietly anymore. It would respond in a way that made every decision leading up to this moment impossible to deny. The shift from subtle to undeniable happened just after midnight, not with a crash or anything dramatic, but with a deep, almost hollow sound that traveled through the ground like a distant echo, the kind you feel more than hear, and it pulled me out of sleep instantly, because I had been expecting it, waiting for the moment when pressure stopped redistributing quietly and started forcing visible change. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the sky still heavy with low clouds, and the entire street felt different under my feet, softer in a way that had nothing to do with surface moisture and everything to do with what was happening below. And as I walked toward the line of newer homes, I could see it even in the dim porch lights, driveways that no longer sat flush with the street, edges dipping just enough to catch shadows where there used to be clean lines. Linda's property was the clearest signal, her front walkway now noticeably uneven, one side lower than the other by nearly an inch and a half, enough that a small puddle had formed and stayed, reflecting the light above it like a quiet warning. And as I stood there, I heard that ticking again, sharper now, more frequent, followed by a faint grinding sound as the concrete adjusted against the shifting soil beneath it. A door opened across the street, and one of the homeowners stepped out, looking around with that confused expression people get when something familiar feels wrong. And within minutes more lights flicked on, more doors opened, neighbors stepping outside in pajamas and jackets, drawn by the same uneasy awareness that something had changed while they were not looking. I kept my distance, leaning against the edge of my fence, watching as they tested their steps on driveways that no longer felt level, as they crouched down to run their hands along cracks that had widened overnight, some now large enough to fit a finger into, clean breaks that followed invisible lines beneath the surface. Linda came out last, her posture still trying to hold on to control, but the moment she stepped onto her walkway, I saw it, the hesitation, the way her foot paused mid-step as she felt the slope that had not been there before, and she looked down, then up, scanning the surrounding houses, finally seeing the pattern she had ignored for weeks, the alignment of changes that pointed to something larger than isolated defects. The contractor's temporary markers from earlier inspections had shifted too, some tilted at slight angles, others no longer aligned with the measurements they had been set to track, and I could almost trace the pressure path just by following those small distortions, the same route the creek had always taken, now forcing its presence back through everything built on top of it. I checked my watch out of habit, noting the time, Because moments like this matter, not just for understanding what is happening, but for proving it later, and I knew this was the threshold point, the stage where movement becomes visible across multiple structures at once, where no single explanation can contain it anymore. And as the neighborhood stood there under the dim lights, quietly realizing that the ground beneath them was no longer behaving the way they expected, I could feel that slow, steady pressure reaching a level it had been building toward since the day they sealed that creek, and it was not finished yet, not even close. Because once a system like that starts correcting itself, it does not stop until balance is restored, no matter what is standing in the way. By sunrise the next morning, the neighborhood no longer looked like a place that had just been built. It looked like something that was slowly being reworked from underneath, not violently, not suddenly, but with a steady, undeniable shift that changed how everything aligned with everything else. And the first thing I noticed was the street itself, the way the asphalt no longer met the driveways cleanly. Small lips forming at the edges where there used to be smooth transitions, subtle rises, and dips that caught the light differently, creating shadows where there should have been none. I walked the length of the block, boots scraping lightly over surfaces that now felt uneven, and every few steps there was another sign. A new crack branching off an old one, a seam widening just enough to notice, a mailbox post leaning at an angle that had nothing to do with wind or installation error, and the air carried that same damp, mineral scent, heavier now, like the ground was saturated beyond its limit and had no way to release it. Linda's house had become the clearest example of what was happening, not because it was worse than the others, but because everything there was happening faster. Her driveway now split into multiple sections by intersecting cracks that followed a pattern I could trace in my head without looking at a map, each line marking where pressure was finding resistance and pushing through it. And her front steps had shifted just enough that the top riser no longer sat flush against the doorframe, creating a thin, visible gap that had not been there before. I watched as a structural inspector arrived mid-morning, this one different from the earlier contractors, carrying a tablet and a set of instruments designed to measure more than surface-level changes. And he moved slowly, methodically, scanning, recording, placing sensors along key points. And I could tell from his posture that he understood what he was looking at, the way he paused longer at certain spots, the way he traced the lines of damage outward instead of focusing on isolated areas, building a picture that extended below the surface. Neighbors gathered in small groups again. But this time there was no attempt to minimize what they were seeing. Conversations were direct, voices lower, more serious, and I heard one of them mention foundation integrity, another talk about long-term stability, and those words carry weight because they mean the problem is no longer cosmetic, it is structural, it is something that cannot be fixed with surface repairs or quick adjustments. Linda stood nearby, listening more than speaking now, her usual certainty, replaced by something quieter, something more cautious, and when the inspector finally approached her, I saw the moment he chose his words carefully, explaining that the movement was not isolated, that it followed a subsurface pattern consistent with water displacement and soil instability, and even from a distance I could see that those words landed differently than anything she had heard before, because they were not opinions. They were observations backed by measurable data. I turned back toward my house after a while, not because there was nothing left to see, but because I already knew how this would continue. The system beneath them was not correcting itself in a single motion. It was unfolding step by step, each change leading to the next, each adjustment redistributing the pressure in ways that would affect every structure built along that buried path. And as I stepped onto my own property, the ground still firm beneath me where the creek had been allowed to exist, I could not help but notice the contrast. The difference between land that is working with its natural design and land that has been forced into something it was never meant to support, and that difference was becoming more visible with every passing hour. By the third day, the neighborhood stopped asking what was happening and started asking who was responsible. And that is when the tone changed completely, because uncertainty can be tolerated, but accountability demands answers, and I could feel it in the way conversations shifted from speculation to documentation, neighbors taking photos with timestamps, measuring gaps with rulers, comparing notes not just as concerned homeowners, but as people preparing for something larger, something formal. I was at my kitchen table that morning with my laptop open, reviewing the full timeline I had been building since the first truck arrived. Every rainfall, every soil reading, every visible shift mapped against the original survey lines. And when you lay it all out like that, it does not look like a mystery. It looks like a sequence, a clear progression from cause to effect. And that clarity is what turns a situation into a case. Around mid-morning, a county vehicle pulled up near the entrance, white paint, official seal on the door, and two inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards and equipment that told me this had moved beyond internal concern and into regulatory attention. And I watched as they walked the same path I had traced weeks earlier, stopping at the same points, marking the same inconsistencies, following the invisible line of that buried creek as it reasserted itself through the ground. Linda stood nearby again, but this time she was not leading anything. She was answering questions, her voice measured but no longer confident, and I could see the difference in posture, the way her shoulders held tension instead of control, because now the conversation was not about perception or presentation, it was about documentation, about evidence that could not be adjusted to fit a narrative. One of the inspectors knelt near the largest crack in her driveway, measuring depth and width, then noting something on his form before glancing toward the adjacent properties, connecting the same pattern across multiple structures, and I knew exactly what he was seeing, not isolated damage, but a continuous system responding to a single disruption. I closed my laptop and stepped outside, walking over with a folder in my hand, the printed copies of every report, every email, every warning I had sent before construction even began. And when the inspector looked up, I handed it to him without a word, letting the data speak for itself, because that is the difference between opinion and proof. One can be dismissed, the other builds its own weight. He flipped through the pages slowly, eyes scanning diagrams, timestamps, correspondence, and I saw the moment it clicked, the quiet shift in his expression when the pattern he was documenting aligned perfectly with the one already recorded, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before adding notes to his file. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability, more measurements, more confirmations, more acknowledgement that what had been built here was not supported by the conditions beneath it. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across driveways that no longer sat level, I stood at the edge of my property and looked out over the neighborhood, not with satisfaction, but with a calm understanding of how this would end, because none of this happened suddenly. None of it was random. It was all set in motion the moment they decided to replace a living system with a rigid surface